Hi there, and welcome to the Explaining History podcast. This week I'm going to do something slightly different. I'm going to look at the story of John Lennon in New York between 1970 and 1980, when he was assassinated outside his home in Manhattan. I think the value of looking at John Lennon in this period is that he's obviously a pivotal cultural figure, really, of the 20th century itself. And also, he, during this period of time, has various flirtations with radical politics in the USA, and becomes kind of not necessarily the first extremely high profile entertainer and musician to embrace politics, particularly radical politics, and certainly not the first in the 1960s, but perhaps the most famous. And his involvement with this kind of politics of the counterculture is from time to time both sincere and superficial. There are elements of profound naivety, but also real idealism to it as well. The extent to which any of his efforts could be said to have made any meaningful difference, or to have challenged kind of Nixon's conservative republicanism throughout the period of time that of the early 1970s is probably quite doubtful. Anyway, John Lennon left the UK to settle in New York finally in 1971, but between 69 and 70 he'd had various visits to America. He had become an adherent of primal scream therapy in California, a particular aspect of psychotherapy which involves the letting out of the kind of raw pain and emotion repressed from childhood. I mean, it's not the kind of thing that psychotherapists particularly swear by these days, except perhaps those that really aren't slightly more on the radical fringes of psychotherapeutic practice. But back then it was accepted by primal screamers that this was a way of exercising pain, particularly the pain of abandonment in John Lennon's early childhood by his mother and father, and then again the loss of his mother when he was a teenage boy. And on the first solo album that John Lennon put out, the Plastic Ono Band, there are various references to Mother, in fact even the song Mother. And again, I think this is interesting. If you're looking at this from a social and cultural history point of view, that certain periods of time, certain ways of thinking about individuals, about the mind, about mental health, about childhood, and about trauma become dominant. You only need to look at the case of Marilyn Monroe and her psychoanalyst Ralph Greenson back in the 1950s and early 1960s, and the fact that psychoanalysis then was seen as the kind of the holy grail, or the kind of the magic bullet to cure all manner of sort of suffering and dysfunction and that kind of thing. And it was really the death of Marilyn Monroe that finally began to pose serious challenges culturally and popularly to psychoanalysis. But anyway, we kind of get off the point here slightly, because America was fast becoming a home to John Lennon, and there were, as the music historian Ian MacDonald points out in his great book People's Music, so there were kind of two John Lennons. There was Britain's John Lennon and America's John, and America's John really kind of emerges from 1970 onwards, and the American John Lennon was far more open, far more capable of being the radical counterculturalist and anarchist as he saw himself, that he wanted to be. In Britain, he was outspoken at certain times, but more known for his kind of acerbic wit, his kind of rather sometimes quite unpleasant attitude, than for his actual politics. John Lennon's politics were those quite typical sometimes of musicians, not necessarily kind of schooled in particular arguments, theories, or dialectics, but in kind of broader and more kind of romantic notions. One of the points that Ian MacDonald makes, quite rightly, is that even at a time where we have things like Occupy or various celebrities enunciating different kind of causes that we have today, the extent to which countercultural thinking was de jure for an entire generation particularly of American teenagers and young people, as opposed necessarily to Britain. The American counterculture was always a much bigger, much more sophisticated, much more radical, and much more widespread entity than it was in the United Kingdom. The idea that a rock star would speak out about the iniquities of capitalism, imperialism, racism, and other kind of key radical debates of the day, this was pretty accepted and standard stuff. We have a very much watered down version of this these days. Perhaps the likes of Chris Martin from Coldplay having stickers saying fair trade. It's not really quite the same thing. This is still the age where one could put a poster of Che Guevara on the wall and it's not seen in an ironic light at all. John Lennon was later quite famous for his advocacy of the IRA, again, which kind of raises questions about much of what he wrote in Imagine in terms of peace and that kind of thing. But we'll come to that in a moment. So much of his initial more political music is a result of two conflicts. The Biafran conflict, part of the Nigerian Civil War, which Britain was providing some of the arms for, and also obviously the Vietnam War. So Give Peace a Chance in 1969 and Instant Karma, two of his early solo singles, were directly sort of themed towards these conflicts. The famous bed in Montreal in 1969 was, as far as John Lennon was concerned, a meaningful political protest. He and Yoko took to their bed for a week and put up posters around the room saying, "Give peace a chance," and words to that effect. And a crowd of admirers and the press corps came to observe what was going on. A great many of the press, perhaps quite rightly, treated it as a piece of spectacle without any real substance behind it. And John Lennon was trying to make a kind of a broader point about how that if we all took to our beds, in essence, perhaps the Vietnam War would grind to a halt tomorrow. Taking things to their absurd in order to satirise them and make kind of a serious point about it, and so on and so forth. And the use of billboards around New York with slogans such as "Merry Christmas, war is over if you want it," from John and Yoko. These are very encouraging notions that some Americans who were opposed to the Vietnam War, embraced, but they were little more than spectacle. The reality was that America was divided not between those that wanted the war and those that didn't, but those that wanted to withdraw from Vietnam right away and cut the country's losses, and those that wanted to withdraw from Vietnam gradually and slowly so it didn't look like a defeat. And there were now the fourth American president to have grappled with the problem of Vietnam. Richard Nixon was now in the White House and having to really take on board the legacy of his predecessors' mistakes, and had a difficult, if very narrow, kind of room for manoeuvre. John Lennon had become a kind of a magnet at this phase for the countercultural elite, particularly Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin of the Youth International Party. Believed that John Lennon would really make a considerable difference to their movement, which was obviously a minority fringe political group, really almost on the fringes of the kind of the anti-Vietnam War movement itself anyway, and they were perhaps more attracted to John Lennon's fame and his charisma. He famously, kind of rather naive outpouring on a chat show, said that Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin had always wanted to be rock stars, and he and Yoko had always wanted to be anarchists, and so there was a great deal of crossover there. But the thing that should always be maintained is that John Lennon's political activism was reasonably short-lived and was in many ways carried out when it was convenient for him. And this had followed something of a pattern, really, with John Lennon earlier on in his life, in the mid-1960s, on the famous trip to India to study with the Maharishi. John Lennon had really tolerated Eastern religion and Hinduism for as long as he felt he needed to or wanted to, and then really quite mocked and derided it. It just so happened that the Maharishi was unfortunately rather corrupt and interested in the Beatles' money, and the Beatle who really embraces Eastern spirituality eventually is obviously George Harrison. So John Lennon was quite known for his kind of dabbling in these sorts of things, and somebody of his degree of egotism and kind of narcissism was perhaps always an unlikely revolutionary, unable to, most revolutionaries of metal who continue on for many, many years are able to subsume themselves to the cause. Though then again, you do have a great many egomaniacs amongst them. I think most interestingly in John Lennon's New York years is the 1972 album Sometime in New York City, which is a really interesting document, not just of John Lennon himself, but of the kind of the radical trends of the time. The track on the album, John Sinclair, is dedicated to the manager of the band MC5 and hippie poet and anarchist John Sinclair, who was arrested and given a 10-year jail sentence for the possession of two joints, which he supplied to an female undercover drugs officer after kind of what was clearly kind of an entrapment. And the first the world heard about it was when the activist Jerry Rubin stormed the stage at Woodstock and announced to the crowd that John Sinclair had been arrested, and there were boos and shouts because people wanted to see The Who, really. A fact that I think tells us more about the counterculture and its extent than most other things. The appeal of Woodstock was really because people wanted to go and see the music, not because they wanted to smash the system per se. Anyway, John Sinclair, the song, was part of a kind of a campaign to free him, which is ultimately successful. The extent to which John Lennon's music inspired it is questionable. The rest of the album, Sometime in New York City, features tracks dedicated to the Black Power revolutionary Angela Davis, and his feminist anthem, if you will, Woman is the Nigger of the World. It's admirable, I guess, but kind of clumsy. And the song had the effect of angering both feminists and black rights activists in one go. So it's something of a radical own goal, that one. The album was actually never released in the UK. You can obviously get it now via things like iTunes, but it was seen in Britain that John had kind of lost the plot somewhat and had become Americanized in really a particularly unique kind of way. He'd become part of the American left, and the John Lennon that people knew from the UK, the British John Lennon, was kind of absent somehow. So that album was never a success over here. The radical phase lasted really until 1973, because by this time the FBI had been wiretapping John Lennon for some time, viewed him as a dangerous troublemaker, and even Richard Nixon, and this says probably more about Nixon's state of paranoia than it does about any kind of real threat that John Lennon possessed. Richard Nixon believed that John Lennon was capable of bringing down the Nixon presidency. Obviously, by 1974, Richard Nixon had achieved this himself through the Watergate scandal. So I don't really think that there's much evidence to suggest that John Lennon had the power to seriously bring down the President of the United States, who had, in 1972, been elected with a landslide majority. Anyway, John Lennon was given an order by the US government to leave the USA in 60 days. And this kind of really puts paid to his activism. It was a not too subtle attempt to stop him from speaking out against the Vietnam War, and it was effective. It took Lennon 3 years to successfully appeal the deportation order, and he had leave to remain during that time. But he was fairly candid in saying that the government wanted him to shut up, and he liked living in New York, didn't want to go anywhere else, and decided to do as they said. Now, this is perhaps unfair to suggest that John Lennon was completely cynical when it came to activism. Throughout this period, he had a wide and diverse range of causes, from the British execution of James Hanratty, the convicted murderer, whom John Lennon believed was innocent, though subsequent DNA proof suggests otherwise, through to feminism, gay rights, the anti-war movement, and a range of other things, other kind of radical causes, which had kind of coalesced in the period from probably 68 to 72 as a result of the Vietnam War. In the second half of the 1970s, once America's involvement in Vietnam had ended, the counterculture itself really runs out of steam. There is no draft anymore. There are no students protesting about being sent to Vietnam. The Watergate scandal really kills off the great the great villain of the piece, Richard Nixon. And perhaps was kind of fortuitous for John Lennon that his career as a radical kind of peters out at this time, as it's not a phase in his career for which he's politically, critically acclaimed. It's interesting that probably this phase of radicalism couldn't have happened if he'd have stayed in Britain. It seems very unlikely that that's what would have happened. The British audiences were by and large not really receptive to kind of the politicisation of music in this way. Perhaps if Britain had involved itself in the Vietnam War, things might have been rather different. And I guess America had a kind of a forerunner to the politicised John Lennon in the guise of Bob Dylan in the early 60s, when Bob Dylan's work was highly politicised before really, his Christian phase and the motorcycle crash and all that. So it wasn't unknown for there to be this kind of radical element to American pop music. The fact that John Lennon had a career at all in America, I guess, owes itself to the fact that he was based in the kind of the liberal heartlands, first of California and then of New York. His first foray into making political statements in the USA had been most ill-judged when midway through a US tour in the conservative heartlands of the Midwest, he was pilloried for a rather throwaway remark he'd made in the Evening Standard newspaper back home in London about the irrelevance of Christianity and the fact that rock and roll was bigger than Jesus now, and he found himself in a part of the world that begged to differ. Anyway, the postscript to the story obviously is tragically in 1980 outside the Dakota Building in New York. John Lennon is gunned down, and various ludicrous conspiracy theories have it that it was the system, the man, what have you, that murdered John Lennon because he spoke the truth to the masses and all this kind of nonsense. Really, it's not true at all. I mean, the person who killed John Lennon, Mark Chapman, was a paranoid schizophrenic, a man who had a kind of narcissistic attachment to John Lennon and believed that it was his path to fame. And I suppose this is kind of understandable when you have a culture built on the notion of fame and the consequences of lacking it are kind of meaninglessness and anonymity, and one where firearms are freely available. So this is the point of today, I guess, is that figures like John Lennon, important cultural figures, never really exist within a wider social, cultural and political vacuum. And you can look at this phase of his career from 1970 probably really to about 1973, and it tells us important clues about the times, because people were buying these records. It was commercially viable for him to make them and to make these kind of politicised statements. So there is really a kind of a snapshot of the wider cultural and political trends that were coursing through America in the early 1970s, and by the late 1970s have really kind of started to peter out. Anyway, thanks very much, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast.